Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
We have two guests today on the Cognitive Crucible, Frank Strickland and Chris Whitlock, who are the co-founders of AI Leaders. AI Leaders equips leaders to drive mission impact with artificial intelligence. Frank Strickland and Chris Whitlock, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
We're really glad to be here, John.
Thanks.
The conversation that I'd like to have with you fellas today will cover, unsurprisingly, artificial intelligence and the need for AI leader education. But before we get into these topics, could we start by getting your assessment of our strategic landscape?
What might work, John? I'll start and want Frank to speak to this as well. But from my perspective, we've accomplished a tremendous amount. Awareness of AI, consciousness of the affiliated capabilities has risen pretty remarkably over the past 5 years, especially as it pertains to national security. To me, the challenge that we have is easy to start these small projects and to proliferate them in many places. It is scaling this at a pace that meets the threat environments that our contemporary situation manifests. So up the tempo, at scale, how do we do that? It's easy to start small projects. We need bigger momentum across a broader range of things.
Yeah, and so if you take that scale and pace dynamic that Chris just articulated, the assumption in both the national security community and in the government writ large is that AI is going to play a critical role in helping to offset military capabilities that have evolved to the point that in some cases they're on par with the U.S. military, offset threats that are emerging in the cyberspace, for example, but give the U.S. national security community an offset, an advance, a differentiation against these threats. And then at the government writ large level, one illustration is the National Academy of Public Administration has identified AI as one of the 12 grand challenges that government needs to implement broadly. So there's a lot of dependence and a lot of assumptions in government on the payoff of AI. As Chris noted, then we've got to get on with scaling solutions and get on with it in a brisk pace if we're going to realize that aspiration that government has.
Right. Yeah. So when I introduced you fellas just a couple of moments ago, it definitely did not do justice to your careers and backgrounds. And so a lot of people talk about AI today, and the expertise of those people resides on a spectrum, right? Everything from one end of the spectrum, people who are just kind of jumping on the bandwagon, like, hey, everybody's talking about AI, I'm going to talk about it too, and they've got very little expertise, all the way over to the other end of the spectrum, with people like you fellas who have really lived it and have been engaged in government technology initiatives for a very long time. Could you guys briefly just give an overview of the kinds of things that you've been doing for the last 30 years or so?
Sure. Chris, you want me to start?
Sure.
So we use the number 30 years because Chris and I first joined forces right after Operation Desert Storm in 1991. I had actually come to this covert program, and we didn't use the term AI but we use the term algorithm. And so a lot of the older crowd, of which we are increasingly a part of, can get a little bit frosty about, characterizing some of this as completely new. We've been applying algorithms to data with computing for decades. And I was doing that as a government employee in this covert intelligence program. Chris came out of CIA as an analyst and joined the program as a contractor. And so just kind of fast forwarding 30 years, and Chris will add a little texture. We've done everything from running teams, small teams, delivering work. So, right on the practical level of, hands-on data, hands-on keyboard, doing the work with a small team, to starting an analytics business and growing it and selling it, to then running big businesses, $100+ million businesses for global firms. So, Chris, you can put some texture on that, but that's kind of a sweeping thumbnail of our background.
Yeah, I think hearing that, Frank, what I would add is it's just been a fantastic career, John, to experience the changes throughout it. So when I first met Frank, I was on the consulting side and joined a team. There was a group responsible for developing software. We were working in support of that around database tuning activities, et cetera. But they would automatically correlate positional reports and parametric reports on a variety of different targets. And that expanded such that I ran a lab in Frank's organization for a number of years. And we brought in software, a variety of software that was used or being developed for the military community. And our whole goal was enhance the application of space collected data. And, part of the journey, and it's kind of remarkable to me to remember, is there were some early attempts at automated target recognition in image data. And these would run on Sun Spark workstations. Not very common now, but at the time, state-of-the-art technology in the 90s. And it would allow an image analyst, what was being experimented with was to take a still image, say, of an airfield, and automatically have software identify aircraft, at least identify that there is an aircraft, maybe classify it by type, fighter, cargo, et cetera, or even type series. That's a MiG-21, it's not a MiG-25, et cetera. But in that window, there were senior leaders, like really knowledgeable engineering experts, who were highly dubious about the prospect of large-scale automation of target recognition for image data. And if you fast forward to today and where we are with that, the compute infrastructure has changed remarkably. And so the teams we have led, we've kind of been on that river as we're navigating the rapids, if you will. We've watched it change from some kind of laughable, when I look back at them now, workstations in the early 1990s, to things that, our teams do in the cloud, or have done in the cloud, or even on desktop compute, which are just phenomenal. And that to me has been great. It has changed really amazingly over the course of 30 years. For my part, in the partnership that Frank and I have had, I've been very focused on analytics, analytic techniques, leadership of teams. Some of those have been large, 100+ people building machine learning and artificial intelligence models for clients around really practical problems. And yeah, in parallel to Frank, leading big business units. So facing the challenge of developing people, both data scientists and more generalist leaders, and then working with clients who represent the entire spectrum, from very expert in things like this AI and machine learning, to they're learning and they're very excited and they want to learn, but they're not far up the ladder of understanding, so to speak.
Okay, fantastic. Well, you started talking about this just a little bit, Chris, but I guess I wanted to ask you a little bit more specifically about talent management. So this is something that has come up numerous times within this podcast forum, as Western societies and allies of Western societies grapple with the information problem and cognitive related challenges. Developing the right people is, not developing the right people, but developing in people the right skills in order to engage productively is like right at the top of the inbox as far as things that need to be worked on. So how do you guys look at talent management in artificial intelligence?
Maybe I'll start us off, Frank, and elaborate because I will certainly miss it. But I would say central in our thinking, John, is the recognition that we have a really consequential leader gap. And it's got two sides to it. On the one hand, we have collectively, and this is in academia as well as in industry and government, done a really nice job of promoting learning for data scientists, learning the software packages are Python, others, commercial off-the-shelf packages, and techniques that they need. But not the leader skills, particularly pertinent in the government to navigate integrating these capabilities into programs. And then on the flip side, we often have career professionals, government and industry, who are in consequential positions for programs. But AI is newer. They may come from a technology background, maybe from a mission background or other. But this is new content, and navigating how to bring it into the environments successfully is new territory for them. And, our belief is that gap is a part of the reason we're not achieving the desired pace, and that you get this noise in the system about too many science projects, not enough deployments into operations. The gap for us, the leader gap, is a big facet of that.
Yeah, and then if you go forward from that, John, so we have this leader gap, and I think what we've observed in both government and industry is an implicit, if not explicit, assumption that I can fill that leader gap by just putting smart people who are aware of AI and maybe even have a STEM background, just putting them in the gap. And we would argue empirically that does not work. It's not, leading an AI program is not common sense, and it's not something you take a smart generalist, even somebody with a STEM background, and say, go lead this program. And we'd use as an analogy the software revolution. Mark Andreessen wrote this article in the Wall Street Journal in 2011 that software was eating the world. And basically his assertion, which proved to be prophetic, was that software was going to transform businesses and eventually governments, but that the economy was going to be transformed by the proliferation of software applications. Seems straightforward now in 2023, but in 2011, that was a fairly prescient op-ed that he wrote. Well, I remember vividly from my government experience and working with government, Chris would testify to this as well, government really stumbled in this era because it tried to take people who were smart major program managers, I put that in air quotes, and say, okay, go run a major software program. And what they found out was that there was specialized knowledge that needed to be gained in order to effectively run a major software program. And we would say that analogy applies to AI. There is specialized knowledge about how to structure and lead an AI program and an AI project, and people need to get that training in order to be effective as leaders.
Yeah, Frank, if you think about some of the conversations we've had with people, and John, I think you will resonate with this. If we want to train a geospatial analyst today to join the workforce, Well, they complete a curriculum that is very focused on the knowledge and skills, the abilities that they need to perform that frontline job. Well, that's not the same training we would give to someone doing a signals intelligence job or doing a logistician's job or a human capital frontline worker's job. There's job specificity. And for this, we think there's functional specificity. If we want leaders to do well here, we need to arm them with knowledge and then leader practices that are pertinent for accelerating this and avoiding some of the pitfalls. And the pitfalls are there. You know, this is not, there's no easy button on this. You can screw it up by the numbers, even as a leader, in over delegating or in failing to check and watch certain facets of the process.
Yeah. For military officers, John, they would immediately resonate with this analogy. The military trains infantry officers to command infantry units. Now, over time, they might cross-train and go and run an armor unit or a cavalry unit, but you don't take any military officer .us.mil and say, well, go command this unit because you're an officer and, you know, you can command, you're a good leader, you've got command skills, you know, go command this logistics unit. No, they put trained logistics officers in front of it because it's not amateur hour. There's specialized skill that needs to be had. And that's another good analogy of just, we have to take bodies of knowledge around how to lead AI programs and projects effectively. And we've got to get that into leaders' heads, and we've got to do it quickly.
It strikes me that it might be useful before we go into, you know, some of your additional thoughts about AI leader education, is to just get like a big broad 101 on, you know, what the artificial intelligence pipeline looks like, from I don't know, conceptualization all the way through the various different projects, all the way to, you know, here's AI delivering insights to a decision maker. How do you describe that process?
Maybe briskly, Frank, I can take that and help me out if I give too little attention to something. But John, generally speaking, we would say every one of them starts with selling an organization. And we don't mean that in sales context. We mean whether you're a government member or whether you are an industry member, you're trying to sell an organization on the need. What is the need, the concept that is at play here? And you can root a project badly from this initial stage, horribly. It can fail to launch, or you set it off on a path which almost guarantees that it's going to underperform. But selling a project is crucial. Got to initiate, and there are a set of activities that are associated with that with any team, but establishing a clear baseline of current performance is an essential upfront task. What am I trying to best? How am I trying to improve performance over time? And that baseline is clutch, as well as understanding what the tech environment is going to be for the task. And there are differences between the training of an AI model and then the deployment. And a leader has got to ensure a good tech assessment on both sides of that. The third activity is getting data and assessing and exploring the data before you ever engage in the detailed model development. We have seen projects run off the track here badly. And if there were a single leader practice we would highlight, it's make sure your team has sufficient domain knowledge, mission knowledge, or has access to people either with full-time membership on your team or reach back to fill in those gaps. And then there's the cool part that everybody wants to talk about, and that is training the model. So we want to take a mission need. We've now secured data. We understand this data. We've done some things to prepare it. Now let's fit a model to it. And really, we're going to be fitting several and seeing what gives the best performance in that environment and evaluating that We'll review it with users and with the larger development team that we work with. And once that's done, then we integrate it into a bigger environment, and you have to monitor its performance long term. And those are really the 6 big activities that we think about for leaders: is sell it, initiate your project, secure the data, train the model, integrate the model, and then monitor. Those 6 things you've got to be able to do end to end. Frank, any emphasis issues that strike you listening to that?
That was really good, Chris. I think just something that people should be aware of, it sounds like 6 steps that moves from A to B to C to D, when in fact, selling the project, first of all, is an ongoing activity. You can get advocacy and resources and sponsorship for your project or even your program once, but you've got to keep those stakeholders on board throughout the life of the project, especially when you have stumbles and maybe even have failures. And failures is not a bad thing in AI if they're managed properly. So the selling, quote unquote, or the building advocacy is ongoing, and then a lot of those steps that Chris articulated are iterative and work together.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thanks for that overview. So you guys are, really laser focused right now on AI leader education. So maybe we can get your take on, what does that mean? And it's really easy in the national security community just to think strategic, operational, tactical, right? Big picture, smaller picture, and then down where the rubber meets the road. And it would be the same in the corporate space as well, I would assume. But let's maybe stick with a national security lens on this. What are the kinds of things that you are trying to communicate to leaders that reside in those different areas of engagement?
Chris, I'll kick off and then you jump in. So you actually implied an element of our approach, John. There are different leader roles throughout the national security enterprise. And so we have something that we call the AI leadership stack. It's 4 courses, and the 4 courses are tailored to different roles. So at the strategic level, interestingly enough, from our perspective, we would say that the strategic need for training is not just with departmental, cabinet secretaries, the Secretary of Defense, the Deputy Secretary, but in the national security enterprise, we think every officer and senior NCO in the Department of Defense should have training at a level that we call AI for everyone, that gets them beyond the buzzwords and gets them beyond the awareness level, so that they can interact intelligently in formulating requirements and in identifying opportunities for AI. So that is one level at the strategic level, where we have a course called AI for Everyone, where we're trying to equip people to smartly engage in the requirements and opportunity identification.
Yeah, I think that's good. The other dimension of this, Frank, to me, that we've talked a lot about over time is, John, we prepare capabilities for use. We develop capabilities, and then we use them potentially at the strategic, the operational, or the tactical level, as you outline. But that development activity, which in the Department of Defense is acquisition oriented, it's research and engineering, it's acquisition and sustainment, it's program executive offices and programs. They're the ones that are securing what we need to fight and win. They're the ones securing what we need to operate daily in the majority sense. And we need for those leaders, whether they are guiding the program itself or whether they are running projects within a program, to be much more savvy about AI and the dynamics of making it real. And just a reality check, we often look to the commercial sector and think, oh, if only we could be like them. And I'm glad Frank laughed, because that really captures kind of our view. Work a little more in the commercial sector before you get too animated about that. Yeah, there are great success stories out there, but as I'm wont to say, we're not running frickin' DoorDash here in the national security sector. And there are challenges that we have which are different from theirs. But even in the commercial sector, Gartner Group does year-over-year surveys, and commercial entities would score that we're pushing less than 50% of AI initiatives into operations. They are derailing because of their inability to integrate into big architectures. They are derailing because they have security issues that were not accounted for in the AI development process, or they are derailing because they run into performance problems in the modeling itself. And I frankly think that number that they're talking about is about 50%. That's probably large. There's a lot of experimental and small scale work that goes on that does not get into operations. And it definitely is happening in national security. By arming more leaders practically, how do you guide these projects? The integration at the program level and the execution at the project level, we believe we can get those numbers up, right? We believe we can create more capability that's useful, but it doesn't happen today, and it doesn't happen magically in the commercial sector. It's challenging work, and we should recognize it as challenging in national security. And back to, I'm not taking an infantry officer to run the engineering department on a destroyer. We need to train people around this. That's our passion.
Yeah, so you get the two other levels. So AI for everyone, broad and strategic. AI for senior leaders, for the program executives and big program managers Chris was talking about. AI for project leaders, moving down a level. And then there are a group of leaders that are just dedicated to running big AI programs. If you think within the major intel agencies, Department of Defense, Department of State, increasingly you have chief AI officers or chief data and AI officers, and they have offices and staffs and activities, and they're leaders that are exclusively focused, 24/7 on AI. And so we have a flagship course called the AI Leaders Course that equips those leaders. So you get this stack that covers everyone from, a requirements officer through program and project to dedicated AI leaders. And we think that sort of tailored approach is key to, again, creating the number of leaders that have the right skill set across the enterprise.
Yeah, John, a thing that strikes me as I was listening to Frank too, and I certainly didn't speak to it before, but your original question, how do you think about those three different levels? One thing, Frank, that hits me for users is realizing in today's environment with burgeoning information and often open source, use Ukraine as an example, right? As that war has evolved, the use of open source intelligence has jumped remarkably. But that, John, was not all with pre-built capabilities that, the United States brought to the party to help or working with partners. There was a lot of work on the edges. And I think for a user, whether you're in the special operations community or you're in the general purpose force, you're at a combatant command level, recognize that in today's environment, you can mobilize these assets in the form of data scientists working as teams to address things that are real time and emergent. And we should expect that, I think, in the course of normal operations going forward. We need the big programs. The big programs need more energy, but almost anything we run into is likely to present innovation at the margins, innovation at the edge, and recognizing that for leaders in the user community and the mission part of the work is important. And then having a network built where you can reach back for that support is key.
A lot of stuff there. So one thing that I'm wanting to verify that that you guys are saying is that based on your observation. So it's a common complaint within the national security community that our software acquisition and our process of adopting new technology, it's all messed up. And gosh, it would, if only we could do what the private sector is doing. If only we could move at the speed of the private sector. And I think I heard one or both of you say, hang on, it's not all rosy on the private sector side also. Did I hear that right?
Yeah, for sure you heard that. I mean, Chris cited the Gartner research and the relatively small percentage of models, and we think 50% is actually high. But let's just say it's 50%. So you got a coin flip chance with any given initiative you start commercially and moving it into operations. The other thing we've experienced is Chris and I have worked in large global firms that are predominantly commercial firms. And in our last experience with Deloitte, we worked in a firm where the government business and the commercial business were very closely intermingled. So we would go and sit with our commercial colleagues that were working in consumer packaged goods and energy and natural resources and technology, media, and entertainment, all sectors and industries of commercial. And we would sit with AI leaders that were working there, Chris and I doing it on the government side, and we would exchange leader practices. And yeah, we've very clearly and quickly understood, it's not all sunshine, blue skies, and soft breezes on the commercial side.
Yeah, Frank, and I realize we're probably prone, John, to maybe overstating this slightly, but yes, we said that. Yes, we said that. And
Okay.
I would go even one step farther, Frank. So in being responsible for a group of 400 or so, 450 data scientists, John, a lot of them have gone on to other places. So network is big. When it comes to data scientists and analysts who are active in the community. Some of them have gone to great graduate schools and then on into work. And I can tell you by the numbers, you could lift the hood on major brand name companies today. And the reality is there's a tremendous amount of really important stuff that no different than DoD is being run on spreadsheets. And they don't have an infinite amount of money to integrate all their systems. So you could go to major brand names that we would think about today and go, ooh, if only I was there. And they have stovepipe systems, Shazam. It's not all perfection on that side. And we're certainly not saying there's nothing to learn. The contrary, we should learn aggressively from wherever we can. What we are saying is don't idolize that crap. Don't idolize it. There are things that you can draw.
The grass is always greener.
Yes.
And yet it's not.
Yeah. And well, a practical tip now this is for principals in the national security community. So cabinet secretaries, Bill Burns at CIA and his immediate reports, et cetera. For the principal leaders, we would also say respectfully, but clearly based on our experience at the deck plate level, be very careful about, I'm going to grab some commercial leader in AI and I'm going to put them in a leadership role and they will just naturally flower and do wonderful things because, again, it's the same assumption. Chris mentioned this earlier. At the individual data science level, at the project level, at the program level, at the strategic level, domain knowledge is much undervalued. You have to understand the domain in which you're going to deploy a model. And that starts at, I'm a Mark 1 Mod 1 data scientist, and I'm trying to write a logistic regression to help out with a supply problem. And you could just extrapolate to all the other use cases in the national security enterprise. You must understand the domain. And so I'm not saying that people can't come in from commercial and do wonderful things. They can. but it is a blind assumption to assume that you're going to grab, every commercial AI leader and they're going to knock it out of the park in the national security enterprise. They have no domain knowledge, and it's a huge deficit.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And so we are recording this on April the 6th, 2023. And just in the news in the last couple of days, there is some relatively well-known Apple executive was just brought into the Defense Innovation Unit, and perhaps that was the thinking of the people who made that choice. It's like, hey, here's a successful private sector tech executive. Apple obviously has been very successful. This individual is going to is going to supercharge our innovation and tech adoption. And maybe, but you guys are saying, well, yes, maybe, but domain expertise is like really the coin of the realm here.
It's huge. We would applaud that, like loudly applaud that. And thank you for going around on it, John, because it would be easy to misunderstand, I think, what we try to communicate. The National Security Commission on AI said it really well. You will not solve this AI challenge by hiring a couple of people with commercial background or Silicon Valley background, and they're going to solve this problem. It's endemic. We have just in the Department of Defense, we have 1,000 acquisition category 1 to 3 programs. And these are programs in excess of $100 million, which are building enduring capability, 1,000 of those. And every one of those 1,000 was approved by the National Board of Directors. 535 members of the legislature, right, that you're getting together through committee and other, they have recognized that program met a need. They have determined funding for that over multiple years, and those programs aren't infinitely elastic. So yeah, you can bring in some ringers from the outside. How many of those ringers had a board of 535 that set their spending levels? And how many of those had a board that determined parameters on all their significant programs? I would argue zero. Right. And it just emphasizes Frank's point. If you walk into this milieu and you are not hip to some of the inherent constraints, you could get frustrated quickly as well. But we applaud that expertise. Bring it in, but don't assume that it's a silver bullet.
Yeah. So one more question before we wrap up, fellas. So yeah, along those lines. So you obviously have had a long perspective on these kinds of initiatives and challenges. What are some of the hopeful or positive initiatives that you're seeing, which you think might have the most promise towards really moving the needle on tech adoption and AI adoption? I don't want to lead the question too much, but like, for example, DARPA, right? DARPA's been around for a long time. Is the DARPA model still a good model? Or, you have these small business seed funds, right? Like the SBIRs, from, I think it's the National Science Foundation, or the DoD has its own SBIRs. What engagement projects are active right now or are coming online that where you guys perceive the most value in tech adoption?
Frank, you might think about that, and I'll give an initial answer here, but there are some areas that, to me, John, in the context of the third offset that Frank mentioned, the third offset in defense strategy and defense innovation emphasizes autonomy, that our units and capabilities need to be more autonomous as we go forward. Now, that's not simply in a robotic sense. It's autonomous, effective interaction. And that can be manifest in software systems at rest that become much more autonomous in processing data, making decisions, triaging, et cetera, or in autonomous physical systems. And you mentioned DARPA. there's been a long multi-decade journey on autonomous vehicles, and DARPA has been really important in that, and the services are taking it. It's amazing to me what is going on in unmanned vessels in the Navy, undersea vessels, surface vessels. That gets a lot less attention, in my view, than some of the unmanned aerial systems have gotten over time. And I think you can expect more in the direction of fully autonomous. The last couple of decades, we've lived a lot with remotely piloted aircraft. So the aircraft itself is unmanned, but we still got a pilot and crew members that are sitting back and operating that. I think, you are increasingly seeing fully autonomous systems. Lockheed just did a test with an F-16 variant that was over a dozen hours of autonomous operation, the aircraft operating that way. And I think we should look for that and be excited. The other thing that I would highlight, Frank, is just text. All the many things that we have across the federal government, and you could include state and local, we produce a prodigious amount of text. And the capabilities that are maturing here on desktops for data scientists, as well as packaged capabilities, are really exciting. And I think there's a lot more to come with regard to natural language processing and things of that nature. Frank, how about you?
I'll do two examples, and one of them from a tech standpoint, people might find relatively mundane, and I'm choosing it with malice of forethought for that reason, because in terms of exotic tech, it's pretty straightforward, but in terms of impact, I think the impact over time is going to be tremendous. And then I'll take one that is out on the bleeding edge of tech. So as government moves further and further into the cloud adoption, it is moving further and further in making data available with the associated compute for what I call self-serve analytics. In other words, every leader that has questions that should produce data-driven answers, they're not having to deal with what Chris articulated a bit ago, rounding up a horde of spreadsheets, doing data calls, having these stupid staff meetings with stupid PowerPoint charts. I mean, every leader in the enterprise hates that crap. Because
Really?
it's just,
I hadn't heard that before.
yeah, it's horrible. And so the full realization of that is not here yet, but you can see it begin to happen incrementally, where data is being aggregated, it's being made available, the compute is there via cloud, and then the tools are available in, I'll just call the business analytics or business intelligence space, the dashboarding space, so that leaders can get their questions answered at the click of a mouse. And here's a simple example, but then you extrapolate this over the course of the entire national security enterprise. We had a client that we did this for. Chris and I have done a bunch of these types of applications, BABI applications, they're known in the trade. And we had a leader who had a staff of about 24 analysts, and he was dragging them through a 60-minute meeting every day to assess where their production stood against the priorities. And, a 60-minute meeting like that, it just sucks the life out of the unit. It's inefficient. It wastes time. It's a big kick in the junk from a morale standpoint. They put a capability like this in place, and they had a twice weekly stand-up meeting, and the meeting didn't last more than 10 minutes. And so they literally stood up for the meeting. Now, set the time savings aside, what was really key in that difference is that each of those leaders were coming into that meeting and they already knew where they were having performance problems. And so they were answering the senior leader's questions before he or she asked the questions, because they had thought about it ahead of time. that starts to accelerate the performance of an enterprise. And so that's one example, John, that, people could say, well, cloud and data aggregation and dashboarding, that's pretty mundane. Yeah, it's mundane from a tech perspective, but it can have a hell of an impact when you think about deploying it across the entire enterprise. Then one similar to Chris, when he mentioned a couple of the leading edge examples, I am a big proponent of agent-based simulation and reinforcement learning at scale. And basically, we are developing slowly the capabilities. And you mentioned DARPA; they've done some work in this space. IARPA, the intelligence community's version, doing some work in this space to program agents and wind them up at scale. People, cars, planes, trains, electrical power grids, cellular networks, et cetera, and have them interact the way they would interact in the real world. And what it allows us to do is explore some what if questions in the national security space. The best analyst in the national security space is using alternative hypotheses to try to anticipate what's next. Warning would be a classic mission there, but there are many others. Resiliency of the homeland is a big mission there. And there's evolution of agent-based simulation leveraging cloud compute that I think will be tremendously valuable in the coming years. So those are a couple of examples.
Yeah. All right. Excellent, fellas. Well, closing out, I like to ask guests a couple of closeout questions. Could you guys offer a fruitful research question that a student who is interested in this general space might take a crack at to contribute to the body of knowledge?
Well, one thing that would strike me, John, that I think could be valuable, you get a ton of attention today, obviously, on the large language models, the OpenAI projects and affiliated ones with other groups. Those are phenomenally capable. They draw on typically more historical information. So if you take ChatGPT, the cutoff on the data is 2020, right? A question starts to become, in my mind, how will those perform when they have contemporary data feeds and you're dealing with novel or emergent issues? So the way that they write and respond is probabilistically based. That's how a large language model works. It makes me cautious about how it can be used for certain kinds of activities like intelligence summarization, as an example, or I want to do operational summarization in a supply chain context, et cetera. But I think that type of thing is interesting. Can we take large language model type capabilities, or those in actuality like BERT, and in a real-time setting establish how well would that perform given the real-time feed and then novel or emergent topics. And I think there's a boundary there probably that researchers can explore and identify, or eliminate any concern we might have about the performance of a capability like that.
Yeah, I like that question. And that really starts getting into the field of complex systems and complexity science, and extracting insights from systems which are constantly changing, and what was true last week or last month, or whatever the last relevant time frame was, may no longer be true. The correlations, the interactions are now different because the complex system is interacting and changing in nonlinear fashions. And so how do LLMs and the insights that are generated from LLMs grapple with that continual intake of novel data? That is an awesome question.
Yeah, I think you might find listeners who are plugged into research programs that could spawn that as well. But there's a related thing. Frank mentioned simulation, et cetera. But one of the problems in AI modeling it would be well understood. It's difficult to predict sparsely occurring events. Things that seldom happen, well, take the overused black swan. It's difficult to predict that. Well, in a large language model context, when you're dealing with novel content, I'm dealing with new emerging details where the repository is not filled with this content, right? How will that technology perform? And what would we need to do with that technology to make sure that it performs well? I mean, Google, it's billions of searches a day that hit the Google search bar, right? I want to say it's 7 billion plus searches a day on the Google search bar. We're not going to have that in the national security community, right? You start wiring our sources in, our classified sources, our program sensitive sources for material support, et cetera. It's not going to be that volume. So they're not sparse events, but it's not the same as what you're doing with a big commercially available, technology like some of these large language models.
Great. Yeah. Awesome. Frank, did you have a thought along these lines as well, or?
Yeah, I'll tack on to the simulation point that I made earlier, and I'll apply it to cyber. There's work that is being done on cyber ranges to both look at both ends of the cyber, more the offense and defense element. But the ranges, because they're physical, they have a certain scope and scale, whereas simulation would allow you to do some things to look at the interconnection of cyber activities and the analog world in which we live. And so if you think about electrical power, if you think about telecommunications, if you just think about people moving throughout a city, a large scale city, multiple millions of people, modeling how parallel cyber attacks that are designed to have physical infrastructure effects, that lends itself right now to simulation. There isn't really a range capability where we're going to model those sort of things at scale. You're not going to build a city. And so building digital cities and being able to model those events for, again, defensive as well as offensive purposes with some of these agent-based simulation capabilities, I think that's a very rich area of research.
Does that go into the world of things like digital twins and being able to construct these artificial simulations of real world phenomenon and testing, using those as testing environments?
It does. The key distinction, so the short answer to your question, John, is yes. The key distinction from what some have seen in digital twins is that in the simulation capabilities, I'm actually able to give the entities in the simulation properties, physics properties, movement properties, if the objects can move, and we actually call them AI properties, thinking and deciding properties. And so I can take a population, for example, and I can demographically stratify a population, and I can give different segments of the population behavioral characteristics in a normal environment, in an abnormal environment, et cetera. And I can do the same thing with the trains, planes, and automobiles and cell towers and electrical power grid. And so you get the entities interacting with one another in the way they would interact in the real world.
Okay, excellent stuff. Closing out, could you recommend a book or other online resource that an interested audience member might check out?
There's certainly one we'd recommend.
Okay, yes, indeed.
You're just saying one?
Yeah, just one. Yeah, I know.
Wow.
Well, while you're thinking, Chris, we would recommend Winning the National Security AI Competition.
All right, fair
A
enough.
practical guide.
Yeah.
There would be two that I would think of. I apologize, John. One, holy mackerel. I think a really interesting book for people that are curious about AI and the computing environment and also policy implications. Chip War, that was written by Chris Miller, not the former Secretary of Defense, but it is a fantastic overview of things that impact our hardware environment and how that is changing. And it is very material to AI applications. Companies like NVIDIA, which is a pioneer in this space and is doing fantastic things to evolve the capabilities available to us, just dependent on these chips, these integrated circuits. And Chip War is a fantastic read in a big picture context for something that's going to be material in our compute layer. The other one that would strike me is T-minus AI. Michael Kanan, who is an Air Force fellow, wrote that. It's a highly readable book on AI. What is it? Why do we need to care about it from a national security perspective? It looks at the intersection of how our minds work and how AI then replicates that, or the areas that it won't over time. But he does just a really nice, easily accessible read on AI. Those would be two that would jump out to me.
All right. Excellent suggestions. And with that, Frank Strickland and Chris Whitlock, thank you so much for being guests on the Cognitive Crucible.
Glad to be with you, John. Have a great day.
Likewise.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.